Good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone you're in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest Zilient webinar. My name is Megan Rowling, and I'm a journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, the charitable arm of Reuters news agency. We are a partner in the Zilient platform, zilient.org, which is building an online network of resilience practitioners from around the world. And the Thomson Reuters Foundation provides much of the news and features on resilience themes you can read there. But today we're going to be looking at how the private sector can help boost the resilience of economies and societies with a focus on disasters and cities. So to discuss this, we're lucky enough to have with us Kellie Bentz, who's Head of Global Disaster Response and Relief for Airbnb, and Michael Berkowitz, who is the President of 100 Resilient Cities. So they're just going to introduce themselves briefly. If we could start with Kellie.
Sure, thanks, Megan. As Megan said, I'm Kellie. I lead our global disaster response and relief efforts here at Airbnb, which is really focused on how we engage our community in times of disaster, so both before, during, and directly following. And then we also work to support our internal teams to engage them as well. And we'll talk about that along with the last 12 years that I've been in disaster response.
Thanks, Kellie. Michael.
And I'm Michael. I'm the president of 100 Resilient Cities. We're the Rockefeller Foundation's $164 million commitment to build urban resilience in 100 cities around the world. We were founded in 2013 to celebrate the foundation's centennial, and we've been working with that cadre of 100 cities over the last 4 years.
Thanks, Michael. So for the first part of the webinar, Michael and Kellie will have a conversation diving into the fast expanding work Airbnb has been doing to help cities prepare for and respond to natural disasters and other humanitarian crises. Just to frame that, cities are increasingly subject to shocks and longer term stresses, from disasters like earthquakes and floods to influxes of refugees, as we've seen in Europe in recent years. And as cities are due to be home to more than 2/3 of people on the planet by 2050, attention's growing on how to help urban areas get better prepared to deal with these events. So after Superstorm Sandy battered New York in 2012, Airbnb began matching its hosts with disaster survivors and aid workers who need emergency accommodation, and has since activated its relief service in 65 disasters, with several thousand free nights donated by its hosts. And just in the past few weeks, it's launched a new platform allowing hosts to offer free accommodation to refugees who are matched up via aid agencies, including the International Rescue Committee. So far, I think 6,000 people have offered to open their homes to refugees at no cost. Airbnb has set a goal of providing short-term housing over the next 5 years for 100,000 people in need around the world, and Kellie is going to tell us more about how the company plans to do that. And leading the conversation will be Michael, whose organisation has deep experience of working with businesses. 100 Resilient Cities runs a platform of partners, which includes leading businesses such as Siemens, Swiss Re, and Microsoft, and they're connected up with city authorities so they can help them plan and execute their resilience strategies. So just on what we're going to do after the initial discussion, after about 25 minutes, we're going to turn the webinar over to your questions, the audience, and you can input those into the chat function at the side of the screen during the conversation. And then I'll direct as many of those as I can to Michael and Kellie. We've also had some pre-submitted questions, and Michael and Kellie are going to try and address some of those too. If you'd like to tweet about the discussion today, we're going to stick with a simple hashtag, which is #resilience. So with that, I'm going to turn over to the interesting part of this webinar, which is hearing Michael and Kellie chat.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Megan, and good afternoon, good evening. So, Kellie, we'd love to talk about Airbnb Welcome and the program to house refugees and other people in need. But before we get there, would love to just maybe baseline a little bit and talk about what Airbnb's approach to disaster preparedness and response is.
Sure. So I think as Megan mentioned, back in 2012, after Hurricane Sandy, our hosts started sending in notifications into our customer experience team, basically asking how could they open their homes, seeing everything they were in New York, New Jersey, and other locations. And so our engineers kind of worked overnight to be able to create the mechanism and allow our hosts to open their homes for $0. At the time, the minimum was, I think, $10. What that allowed was for hundreds of hosts to basically open their homes for both survivors displaced and relief workers deployed to respond. And that was actually in partnership with and announced by the mayor at the time in New York City, which I think typically, and I think we'll talk about this, but definitely helps when we have those partnerships with cities, not just for general public awareness, but then also to understand what's actually happening on the ground, who are the players that are working. Over the last couple of years that I've been here at Airbnb, we've really been building out the program to both bring in subject matter expertise, understand where and how our hosts can most effectively become prepared to respond, but then also engage when something happens. And so over the last couple of years, we've been providing offline trainings in many cities with agencies like the Red Cross or emergency management agencies that provide preparedness training to citizens. So oftentimes there's misperceptions about who our hosts are, and hosts on Airbnb are, you know, people like you and I. And so when we work with emergency management agencies, we're typically saying, you know, these are your citizens in your community. This is, you know, generally the responsibility of the local government to prepare these citizens, but not only do they want to become more prepared, they actually want to help in the response. And so that's been actually a bit of a game changer, I think, as far as how we introduce ourselves in those conversations. Really providing a resource versus asking for anything. So we typically go and work with cities, like I said, typically emergency management agencies, meeting with them to say that we have a few different offerings. One is we can work to help prepare our citizens, and that's becoming a megaphone oftentimes for the information that local emergency management agencies have. As I think, Michael, you can appreciate, typically they have some of the best information, but they're really bad at getting it out. We don't necessarily always have the best information, but we're really good at getting it out. And so trying to marry those two, I think, has been a real win. So what we try to do is on the preparedness side and things, you know, leading up to hurricanes, even at the beginning of the season, we partner with agencies like FEMA and local emergency management agencies to actually send preparedness information that include ready.gov or local authority information to all of our hosts in hurricane-prone areas that actually link to ready.gov and some of those other resources and give very tangible actions. So I think, as we can all appreciate, typically 1 or 2 actions is really as much as people will sort of digest and actually take action on. And so we try to, particularly for hurricanes, ensuring that they have an evacuation route and that they're staying connected in their community. And I think we'll talk about other mechanisms for sort of building that resilience in community. But I think partnerships is certainly a key, both for our community, but also for Airbnb as a company.
And it sounds, and I know this also from my own experience, but that the partnerships with local government is so important. What are the conditions that are ripest for these kind of partnerships? Where does it work really well? And maybe conversely, without naming names, but considering that you have this incredible breadth and expanse of cities that you cover, where hasn't it worked well? And what does that look like?
Okay, so I will try to do this without saying names of people where it hasn't worked well, but I will highlight people and locations where it has worked really well. And so we'll start there. So an example would be Seattle Emergency Management. Their director there, you know, is gangbusters anyway, but I think just generally how they're organized and their receptivity to thinking differently. So some people may be even aware that they're starting to use their emergency operations center and some of their framework for emergencies for actually their homelessness crisis, which is quite interesting and I think very sort of progressive, right? And so if that gives you an idea, I mean, we've been able to host preparedness trainings with emergency management at their locations. We've been able to send messaging to all of our hosts. We've actually been able to activate in partnership with them. We've developed a MOU. We've been able to notify our hosts that we have this agreement in place so that we are able and more prepared. They've offered for us to come and take a seat if we need to during an activation where the Emergency Operations Center is activated, although knowing that likely our team is remote when something happens and most of our engagement is remote. One of the most recent examples that was really successful was there was a building fire, and there were 3 families that had been impacted that were not able to, that was just not best suited for them to be in a shelter because they needed specific requirements. And our team was able to identify hosts that were willing and able to open their home to those 3 families for the time needed. And I think it's a unique offering because the hosts offer a home versus obviously a larger scenario with multiple other people, particularly when people have special needs.
Yeah.
And I think so I would say the receptivity of that agency is huge, and the ability to think a little bit outside the box. So to think about how do they engage not only us as a private sector entity, but we're almost viewed as, and we should be viewed, I think, as a community. So our community, we have 3 million hosts worldwide in 192 countries and 60,000 plus cities. And so it's a much different engagement than just looking at us as a corporation. And where it hasn't worked well is, and again, I won't mention locations, but and I would say my reaction to this when those meetings don't go well is the response is typically, well, we have a plan for that. We don't think we really need private sector engagement. And my answer to that is, you haven't been through something big enough to realize you actually need the entire community. And doing this worldwide for the last 12 years, I certainly feel like I can see it when I see it, as far as when it's going to be a challenge and when it's not. And so I think it's just a matter of education, information, and general cities going through this and realizing they can't do it on their own.
Yeah, I think that's right. And seeing private sector as a real partner and not something to be kept, or someone to be kept at arm's length, because having that conversation beforehand, a really transparent conversation about what needs are and might be, and sharing information and partnership in that way, that's the thing that's going to lead to better outcomes. If it's like, you stay over there, we'll call you when we need you, that is almost never the recipe for success.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think, many cities have found it valuable. At first everyone thinks of us as homes, right? And so they're like, oh, you guys can house more people. But when they realize actually one of our greatest values is our direct connection to guests and hosts. If you think about it, most cities don't know. They might know how many travelers might be in their city. They have no idea how to reach them. And so we have that direct connection. And when something happens, we actually create messaging and directly link to that local emergency management Twitter handle and their website. So that's one of the biggest things we always encourage, is not just for us, but just generally, is people are typically going to Twitter or they're going to their website, and they need that information as updated as possible, because otherwise people are going to get the wrong information. And as you know, as we've seen social media, it's people just start following whoever has the most followers. And so if we can actually get more influencers tweeting the right information, and they will do it, it's just making sure that the agencies responsible for that information are updating it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I want to come back to this idea as as Airbnb as a community, because one of the pre-questions that was asked was about how to involve small and medium-sized businesses. And this is something that's always really challenged me. In the late 90s and early 2000s, I ran public-private initiatives at New York City Office of Emergency Management. And New York City is full of the big business community. So we had Bankers and Brokers Association, we had the Security Industry, Association, we had the Building Owners and Managers, which were all the big real estate landlords and developers. And those communities were easy to reach. But it's getting to the mom and pops, the local shops and the bodegas. That was always the more challenging thing. We ended up treating them more like, private citizens. So we handled them through our citizen preparedness and awareness campaigns as opposed to our private sector engagement campaigns. But looking at Airbnb, it almost strikes me as this might be a model. Now this is 20 years later or something like that, but this might be a model for ways to engage small and medium-sized enterprises in other ways.
Yeah, no, I think what we see, and I think as you can likely appreciate, many of our hosts on our platform are people like you and I, but then there's also the folks that, so meaning that there's a lot of people that are hosts by night, but they have a day job in the day, right? And so engaging them as people like you and I, not just as the large big box store or big box corporation, but also trying to give them more information beyond their general personal preparedness. And I think this kind of goes to, I think back to the days when I was at Target, and one of the, I would say, better programs we had on the preparedness side was actually sending, looking at our employees as people in the community where we could send in preparedness information, not just to the stores to inform them as employees, but actually give them information for personal and family preparedness. Right. And I think, not just looking at private sector as what they offer as a company or as a product, but like their people are their greatest asset. And I think that's what you're getting to is the individuals that live in those communities that are that neighborhood. Yeah. Like I think about myself, I'm an employee of Airbnb, but in my community, I know all of my neighbors, I know my my local laundromat, et cetera. And so getting the information to as many people as possible through those various channels, I think is, both a responsibility and a good thing, the right thing to do for those companies.
And I love this idea of Seattle using this to address homelessness, as well as using their emergency management protocols and systems to begin to address homelessness. Because one of the things we've been talking to communities and to our cities about is how can you get more resilience value for every intervention? And that might mean, if you're going to do a climate intervention, how can you use that to foster social capital and bring, communities together? Because the next thing that happens won't be a climate thing. It will be, terrorism or a refugee crisis or an earthquake or whatever the thing is. But I love this. I love this idea of thinking about emergency management systems, and we've been thinking about it in terms of CERT, community emergency response teams.
Right.
If you just think about them for the big disasters, they almost never get deployed because you don't have that many big disasters.
That's right.
But if you think about them as ways to build community, then they start to, meet each other, meet their neighbors, do some more deployments, and all of a sudden that becomes really powerful. Have you seen any other examples of that anywhere around the world, either at your time at Airbnb or at Target?
I mean, to be honest, like I think back in my NGO world when I lived in New Orleans, and we would, I personally would evacuate, and even just, both in my role serving on a VOAD board, having to go to Baton Rouge and serve out of the, Governor's Office of Homeland Security. Yeah. And I think back to like my neighborhood block, and while we weren't a formal CERT, we had like a block captain, and he would take all of our keys, and I would come home and my yard was already cleaned because he would refuse to leave. Now I do not advocate that, but we always had, and I think that's very unique to certain neighborhoods. Certainly New Orleans is known for knowing your neighbors. You have a porch, and there's that kind of community building. But I think to your point, wherever you can build these communities, you start creating these connections. And I think both in my time in New Orleans, learning after Katrina, what people wish they would have done before was because they knew each other so well, something that is that major. When they left, they actually didn't even have each other's cell phone numbers, which is fascinating because they didn't need them. They saw them every day. They saw them on the front porch and they would say hi. And I think that's just as important as ensuring you have some of these other connections. And I think where we see the value, we've built these, some people may have heard of them, but they're these, our Airbnb host sharing clubs. And these are communities of hosts basically sharing best practices on hosting. Some of these aren't even Airbnb led, like these are host sharing clubs all over the world. There's over 100, I think there's they're just continuing to grow. But I think that we see that as an avenue for us to also prepare those communities. So when we go out, this is where we'll engage an agency like the Red Cross or like a civil protection authority or interior ministry in other countries, and bring them as the expert to those sharing clubs and actually be able to bring some level of expertise, information, but also combine that with kind of a, community building, so there might be a wine tasting or something afterwards, but like making it fun and engaging while sharing necessary and relevant information.
Yeah, and I think the New Orleans example is a great one. I mean, partly the story from New Orleans, and you would know this better than I, but is that New Orleans might have survived precisely because there was that kind of community. If I think back, if New Orleans had been a sort of nameless, identityless Midwestern city, we might have just written it off and said, you know what, this was a bad place to put a city at the mouth of the Mississippi, right next to the super warm Gulf of Mexico, below sea level. Let's just relocate completely. And the fact that New Orleans had a strong identity and had people that knew each other there, that is part of a community resilience. And I think, partly it's a private, to your point, this is a private sector role, but also a public sector and community institution role of how we begin to create and foster that, because it's that kind of identity and familiarity and those bonds, that cohesion, that's the difference between a community surviving and hopefully ultimately thriving after a big disaster versus one that doesn't.
Yeah, no, I think it's super important. And one thing that just kind of came to mind that I feel like there's almost this identity crisis happening because there's this, obviously the scale, scope, and frequency of disasters is only increasing, right? And so more and more cities are having to deal with this. But what was originally built is sort of, and excuse the term, but sort of a good old boy system in a lot of these sort of civil protection authorities and emergency management agencies. And this is certainly true. I think a great example is in Australia, where most of the way that they were built was around fire agencies, right? And so you would literally have a good old boy system there. And the emergency management Victoria actually was super progressive and just really strategic. They basically have placed an old fire chief as the commissioner of emergency management Victoria, who is extremely innovative and wants to make a change. And so he gets along with and understands the current dynamic while also making these other innovative changes, bringing tech companies in, working with the community. And I think it's going to take this sort of, and I don't think it's not necessarily a generational change. It's literally just sort of it's part of the times, I think, of integrating all of these pieces together and being thoughtful around how communities can best receive, how to best sort of connect. So there's both this very hyper grassroots community building effort that has to happen while also organizing the actual government response. And I think there's a way to combine and connect those two. It's just a matter of everyone kind of shifting the way that they've thought previously as to how things should or could work.
Great. So, fire is a nice segue to an incredibly tragic event that happened recently, and that's Grenfell Tower fire in London. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about Airbnb's response to that and what you did and what you continue to do.
Sure. So I think, that is a great example of a very awful, large, tragic building fire that, took the lives of many and way too many in a local, for us, a local community that is one of our largest communities from a host perspective, and also our, one of our largest local offices from an employee perspective.
London. You're talking about London here. Okay. Yeah.
And when you look at this, like there's, as you're well aware, there's hundreds, if not thousands of building fires every single day all over the world. But what happened here, we did take a very similar approach to what we do in many markets, which is first reach out to all of our local partners on the ground to understand who's leading the response, where is the greatest need, and then also having to educate and inform our leadership on the ground there, as we have kind of a an internal crisis response framework that we activate in these times, where we work with our government relations leads, we work with our country managers, we work with our communications teams to both make a recommendation for how we respond, but then also which partners we reach out to, and kind of explain that, you know, in the situation as Grenfell Tower, many of those survivors lost their home and we're not going to be going back. And so initially people think, okay, staying in an Airbnb is like perfect. But in fact, our Airbnb hosts often have many bookings or already have bookings. And so actually matching need and availability is quite challenging. So as much as people want to raise their hand and say, I want to help, moving survivors from one place to the next is the last thing you want to do when they've just lost everything and they've been through this very traumatic event. And so what we did was partner with the British Red Cross, who we started to take two different approaches. One initially was those that had lost their lives, their families that were coming in, which we had done actually in Orlando. We were going to be looking at providing accommodations for those families. However, based on the way they were constructing and coordinating that, they didn't feel that was the best place for us. I think we'll get there at some point, but I think for the way that they've had their plans, I don't think that worked out as well as we would have liked. But where we landed was really helping the relief workers for the Red Cross come in and supporting them through our Airbnb accommodations. And so we're continuing to work with them, while at the same time, many of you have probably seen the news where many of the local councils have now either evacuated certain buildings or locations to basically increase their fire safety precautions in buildings so that they don't go through the same thing that Grenfell Tower did. So an example is Camden Council had reached out to say, how can we work with you? The difference there is typically the government, actually the council actually has to provide payment for those locations just based on certain obligations. And so again, it looks very easy for us to ask Airbnb hosts to open their homes, but then on that flip side, they ask, well, the government's supposed to be doing this. So what we try to do in that situation is create the ability to make it easy for Camden Council to offer Airbnb as an offering to their constituents, but not something that we're asking our hosts to open their homes for $0. And I just give all of that context just because it's typically really hard to explain those complexities to people. But it's not like we're sitting on our hands, not trying to help people. It's literally trying to understand how can we most effectively engage our community that's actually making a difference and helping. And sometimes, which is hard for people to understand or not understand, but it's like, it's not to actually open the homes to survivors. I will say there's also other things that happen. So then we also engage our employees where they, like next week, they'll be volunteering, sorting donations that have been come in. So I think as you've seen in many disasters, tons of donations come in, particularly those that aren't needed, but need to be sorted and then properly distributed. So working to engage our employees in that mechanism and also hosts. And then there's also been different fundraisers and things that have been developed in partnership with the local Kensington Foundation and others to be able to provide those direct resources to the survivors. So we try to take kind of a holistic, multi-pronged approach. And to be honest, this was one of our first responses after engaging one of our larger local offices. So now we're also looking at this as kind of a future model for, as far as, determining how we best engage employees and hosts and ensure that we're communicating with them with these complexities.
Yeah, so much of what you said rings true for me. One is that in my experience during the World Trade Center disaster, it was actually a lot easier and cleaner to buy stuff as opposed to use donated stuff. And you're right, there was like donated stuff from people, and we filled massive warehouses with everything, socks and diapers and everything that you could imagine. But there was also large corporations that were looking to donate the use of heavy equipment or personnel. But at the end of the day, a lot of that was much better off contracted for, because it was a much cleaner relationship around insurance and liability and all of those issues that made it easier. And I can relate to your hosts in Camden, where it's like the government has a responsibility it just seems a lot cleaner to use that resource, but in fact to have the government pay for it in some ways. I just had one follow-up question though about, when dealing with the local councils. So London is like many cities around the world, and this is a big issue for urban resilience building. Yeah. It's this tension, and we were just talking about Australia too, where Melbourne or Sydney are one municipality in a greater Melbourne or Sydney area of 30, 40, or 50, and there's not a good governance structure over the top of that. And London has a slightly more evolved structure where you have the Greater London Authority and specific boroughs and councils attached to those boroughs. Talk about how you approach those levels of governance in all of the cities. Is that a really challenging thing, and how do you address it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the country and the local, that sort of, I would say, region and then country. So in the US, there's some cities which you're familiar with, right? There's big city emergency managers, which are the top 15 plus cities that receive the largest number of UASI funding, which is Urban Area Securities Initiative funding. And when you work with those cities, those are typically the largest cities in America. And those sometimes have more, I wouldn't say authority, but more influence over their peers. Yeah. So what we've done there is we've tried to present and give information to people like Seattle, New York, LA, San Francisco, and have them be the champions for working with us to show that we're not here, like this has nothing to do with our bottom line. We're literally here to support you. However, because the US has this other structure of FEMA where they're able to get information out, but they don't have authority until, state, et cetera, kind of comes in, we try to develop relationships at every level. However, when you look at something like the UK, where we're trying to go with that is unless a local authority reaches out to us, we actually try to work with them through the cabinet or the DPLG. So at the federal level, we've been in relationship, I'd say, over the last 2 years, and then we're close to having an agreement, I think. But even without that, we still work together, and I think we say that no matter what. The agreement just allows, and it's a bad analogy, but if I get hit by a truck or somebody else gets hit by a truck, we have something on paper that at least like lets two other people continue to work together. And so the best way to do it is to try to have these relationships at the federal level for us, and then kind of work our way down, just because we're in 60,000 cities, and it's just not sustainable for us to have, capacity-wise, to have relationships with every single city. But certainly in some of those largest jurisdictions, it does make sense to have those individual relationships.
Great. So I have one more before we cede the floor back to Megan to take people's questions online. And that's Airbnb Welcome, which Megan mentioned at the top, is a program to settle or provide housing to 100,000 individuals. You guys announced it this year, and over 6,000 hosts have offered their homes for free to those in need of housing, including refugees, but not entirely. Talk a little bit about that program, and then I just maybe have a follow-up question or two about how it's going and how you're thinking about impact.
Sure. So as we mentioned, we've been the disaster sort of tool, or how we activated our hosts. That idea came out of sort of 2012, 2013 during Hurricane Sandy. Over the last 2 years, we've been building that out, also learning a lot from it. And then in January, well, I'll just back up a little bit to say many people do think of us both as a community, but also as a company. And I think most people probably just think of us as this big company that people connect and rent their spaces. I will say I would not have come here if that was all we did. Our mission, we are really a mission-driven company, right? So meaning our sort of mission is belong anywhere, and we really want people to feel that when they go somewhere that they can live like a local and that they do belong there. And so when I say that, because in January, when the travel ban came down from the US administration, our founders felt directly offended, and sort of they were very direct. So just as Trump might have put something on Twitter, our CEO kind of went back on Twitter and basically said, literally the day after, anyone impacted by the travel ban, Airbnb will support. And so that was very interesting. And when our CEO did that, I knew that was pretty much me and my team. And then building out this much larger team across the company to do that, which we did. We've now, I think, hosted close to 300 people that were impacted by the travel ban, and that was everybody from refugees to people that were coming in that had been translators for the U.S. government. There were many different cases. There was a family that had been here for their child's medical care, and they couldn't go back. They couldn't go back home because if they would have gone home, they couldn't come back in to get more medical care. So it was quite a interesting and a testament, I think, to our company's commitment to belonging. And so out of that, our founders actually decided to purchase a space during the Super Bowl, and they created an ad, and it didn't mention Airbnb at all. It was just all about belonging and accepting differences. And what they did was then at the end had a hashtag, which was #WeAccept, which ended up being the second most used hashtag after #Super Bowl during the Super Bowl, which was pretty powerful. And what ended up happening is you followed that to a link that we had that had a letter from our 3 founders explaining why we did this and made this stance. And then that linked to the ability to list your space. And then you could choose kind of the cause. So we aren't just saying refugees, we're saying refugees are one of many types of displaced people, including disaster survivors, including those that might be in need. So I think, and I wouldn't say we're not even just saying displaced, we're saying those in need. We've received thousands of inquiries, thousands of requests. I think we're still in the process of determining those other causes that we will support. But I think for us, we believe this is core to our mission, has nothing to do with our bottom line, but has everything to do with just sort of delivering on the commitment that our founders made.
Great. So I think we're over time. We'll turn it back to Megan, and we'll see if there are chat questions. If we have time, we should follow up about how social mission and disaster response and bottom line are intertwined at Airbnb, and how you guys are thinking about those 3 things. But Megan, maybe I'll let you get to some of the most pressing questions first.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. That was a really fascinating discussion with loads of insights into very different situations. But I just wanted to row back on something you mentioned in connection with Grenfell, Kellie, and also with your new Welcome platform that's meant to help refugees in places like Milan and elsewhere. Do you see that as a long-term solution for the refugees when it comes to accommodation that you're helping, or is that a kind of medium-term solution? Because as you say, with Grenfell, people are looking for, you know, where am I going to live after this? And so temporary accommodation is maybe not so appropriate. So I was just wondering how you see that new platform in that light.
Sure. So it's really a combination, I would say. So the places that we're currently active in related to the refugee support is Canada, a few cities in Canada, the US, France, Italy, soon to be likely Germany and Spain, but also in Greece. And so in each of those locations, the need, as most people are aware, is very different, right? So in the US, when a refugee has been accepted or has been, you know, they've received their asylum claim, they're flying over to the United States. Oftentimes the resettlement agencies have their housing either changed at the last minute, but, you know, not on their terms, it just happens to be the situation. And then when they arrive, they have to figure out a place for them to stay. Oftentimes they scramble trying to find a hotel room, et cetera, et cetera. That's obviously not number one, the most welcoming place to be, but also, you know, not a good situation if they're only going to stay there a few nights. So what they've asked us on the US side is, can our hosts help provide this gap housing that both welcomes them into the country by having a local host, but then also gives them a home where they can cook, and just give them a little bit better offering before they go into their longer term housing. Scroll to Paris, for example, the requests there are really a minimum of a month up to 6 months. And the difference, most of the difference in Europe, I would say, is their schemes for accommodation and housing is very different compared to the US or Canada. So in Europe, as everyone knows, with the migration flow, many of them, when they arrived, they go into sort of a centralized housing or accommodation location where all of the services are kind of wrapped around or within that same vicinity. After about my understanding from in most countries is like 1 to 3 months, and I'm sure there's various other experiences. Then they go into in some cases it's called decentralized accommodation, and of which private accommodation is one of those offerings. What we're trying to do is fit into that private accommodation offering where what we believe is that our Airbnb hosts, because they already have bookings, are best suited for temporary accommodations, so a few nights to a few weeks. Whereas what we believe is there's actually this other marketplace out there of hosts that just want to host for good or just want to host for causes that may actually have longer availability, so not necessarily long term, but I would say what the request right now from agencies and the need is really 3 to 6 months. And we do believe there are people out there willing and able and available to do it. They just don't have a mechanism to do it. So we're trying to test that theory in multiple markets, and we're still working on kind of refining product and host acquisition strategy, but that's kind of our thinking behind it.
So it's very important to look at the context and the way things operate in terms of asylum systems and that kind of thing, and try and adapt your offer to that. That seems to make an awful lot of sense. Otherwise, you know, to have a successful operation in different places. Michael, I have a question in from the audience, which I think may be one for you. It's related to Southern Louisiana. I don't know how much experience you have there. But it's saying, this is from Rachel Thomas, I think, sorry, I can't see the whole name. As a result of coastal land loss and climate change in southern Louisiana, areas that have not previously flooded may have an increased flood risk in the future. How do we engage small businesses in these transitioning areas to begin preparing for that future? To create more resilient businesses. And we had an article about this actually, about young people wanting to stay in southern Louisiana very recently on Zilient, but saying that, you know, for that to happen, business has to be there, has to stay, has to flourish.
Yeah, I have maybe a couple of sort of related comments, and Kellie actually probably has more experience in southern Louisiana since you live there, but two interesting thoughts related to that question. One is that southern Louisiana is having land loss at a rate and has a climate threat that is so acute right now that this issue about managed retreat, which areas we save, which we need to retreat from, what does that look like? How do you engage people and the small businesses there right now and make some decisions, because you know, they will be able to save part of the wetlands, but there will be other parts that will not be able to be saved. How does that whole thing happen? That is something that is happening now and going on now, and we will be able to, over the next decade, learn from those experiences and understand how that process worked or didn't. And so I think as a laboratory for how we talk about climate change, which all over the world we're going to face, but is being faced now in an acute way in southern Louisiana and the whole Louisiana coastline and wetlands, that is something that we're getting a preview for the rest of the world. And so you know, learning some of those lessons is going to be interesting, and yet you know, tragic and traumatic for those who are impacted. So that's one thing that question, I don't know if I'm going to answer it exactly head on, but these are the two smart things I have to say about this generally. The second is, something that's been really interesting in our work in New Orleans has been that New Orleans is both overexposed to the petrochemical industry and overexposed to climate change. And so one of the things that New Orleans is setting about doing intentionally is to try to turn that liability of being a city that floods and has water management issues and all of those things into an asset. And so as part of a resilience play, New Orleans is thinking about how can they convert the regional economy away from petrochemical industry and to a water management export economy, a la the Dutch. And it turns out that those two economies actually, those two sectors look a lot alike. It's around engineers and skilled trades and those type of sectors. And so wouldn't it be great if we could begin to solve, the New Orleans and Southern Louisiana's area issues around water management, both stormwater, seawater, flooding, build a core expertise and ultimately export it in a way that would wean the region off the petrochemical industry in the Gulf, diversify the economy in a certain way. And that would have big impact both for large businesses, but would spawn a number of small and medium-sized businesses as well.
Yeah, that's certainly the strategy that I was hearing from some of the officials too when I was there in March for the big resilience conference. Kellie, did you have anything to add on that from your experience?
I think strategically in big world, that's amazing and would be really awesome to implement it. Hopefully that is the direction it takes. I think for some of the smaller businesses in this moment or over the next few years in real time, maybe some of the sort of direct feedback or offerings I would say is ensure that you understand what insurance you have as a small business and what you need for those types of disasters that you are at risk or prone to. And then secondly, I would say understand your resources for when something happens. So is it that you are working with your local chamber of commerce? Is it that there's a network of small businesses that you can become a part of? Are there loans from SBA? Typically there are in disaster response that the federal government actually starts funding. And so I think what we've seen, particularly in Southern Louisiana, and we see this over and over, is everyone keeps reinventing the wheel every single time something happens, instead of there being kind of this toolkit to go back to every time something happens, right? And so it kind of exhausts everyone, duplication of efforts, all of these things. And so trying to really hone in on that and pull together what you need before the next thing happens.
Just sort of continuing on that theme a little bit, we have someone tuning in from the Department of Commerce in Montana. And they're asking if the panelists can speak about public-private partnerships in smaller urban areas or rural areas. They're saying many of our communities within the state may not attract the attention of larger companies like Airbnb. So would you recommend pursuing these types of partnerships on a smaller scale? And I guess, if so, how?
Michael, do you want me to take that, or do you want to?
I mean, I'm happy to take a first stab at it. I mean, I can't speak to rural areas because I have very little experience there, but I will say that we have a number of smaller cities in our 100 Resilient Cities network. I'm thinking about Byblos, Lebanon, about Vejle, Denmark. Boulder, Colorado is closer to Montana, wealthy, fairly high-profile city, which may not be analogous to the question you're asking. But one of the things that's been nice about working in small cities is that they are more nimble. And so while they don't have the same capacity and resources, they often are able to pursue priorities with a nimbleness that the big cities don't necessarily have. And so in Byblos, Lebanon, it's a city of 50,000 people probably sopping wet. When the mayor decides to do something and pursues partnerships, they can do that you know, your point about attracting the big fish, you know, is totally true, but they're able to be a much more responsive and nimble partner. So I think that's one thing. The second is that, and we've seen in some places, the companies that are in the small cities are more invested in those cities, and so they might be more natural allies to work with. So you know, any of your sort of local, even in the larger metropolitan region, or you know, it's not going to be a metropolitan region, the larger area that these towns and small cities are located in can attract companies that are invested in a different way in the success of those towns and small cities in a way that maybe in the larger cities they're not. They see it as a much more transactional kind of value proposition. So those would be my two thoughts around that.
Kellie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would definitely echo those things. I would also mention, I think Airbnb is a little unique as far as being different than some of those the big companies you talk about, just in the fact that we do have hosts in Montana, and so that would still be an area of interest for us as a company, but also as a community. And so I think to Michael's point, it's looking at what are the assets or the companies that already exist there. How are you convening them, and what would you need, or what are the potential needs during a disaster that you could potentially forecast? You know, I think we all know that you can plan for about 60% of what's needed, and you're going to have to wing it during a disaster, just because every situation is so unique. But I would also encourage you connecting with your, making sure as the Department of Commerce that you're well connected to the emergency management agency, and that you have those relationships built before, and that there is a private sector liaison working with either the FEMA region for your region that is also kind of connected with their private sector liaison, but then also, you know, at the state and local levels of emergency management, and just kind of keeping everyone connected and having those relationships before something happens, I think is critical.
That's very useful advice. I have one other question for you, Kellie, which is, to what extent do you work with cities and other stakeholders before a disaster hits in order to prepare the service provision and define disaster response strategies, processes, preparation guidelines as part of a local resilience strategy? Is it as strategic as that? Or, I mean, you've mentioned a few examples already, so maybe if you've got anything to add about how you put those relationships in place beforehand.
Yeah, no, we certainly try to build those partnerships and relationships beforehand, and that's sort of a multitude of ways. I think we're finally at the place where we might be able to even be more strategic because we are in so many locations. A lot of our relationships or partnerships have been reactive. Where we've been strategic has been at the sort of federal levels, and then some of those associations like big city emergency managers, and trying to get it to those that influence. A lot of the relationships, just being in the space for a good bit of time, you know, I have existing relationships and then building upon those. And then also we target certain conferences so that we can get the information out, so that certain cities and local folks can understand how to reach us in a time of disaster, so that if we don't have time to build that partnership pre-disaster, they can certainly reach out to us during and be able to, and we can then start working with them when something happens. But when we do have those relationships beforehand, we typically build out a memorandum of understanding or partnership agreement that then is very clear what our roles and responsibilities are in that partnership, and then try to outline sort of operational protocols based on that, which is mostly just sharing contact information and knowing who the right person is to connect with when something happens, and then trying to identify those touch points. So if it's, you know, in the States, if it's National Preparedness Month, if it's in Australia when it's bushfire season or leading up to that, if it's, you know, finding those moments where you can take time to send preparedness messaging, then we do that and send that out to our community as well.
That sounds like very useful practical advice. Again, Michael, as we don't have a huge amount of time left, I just wanted to ask a broader question to you about the wider picture. What, in your view, in your experience of working with many different cities, is needed to really bring private sector into resilience building, whether it's more short-term disaster response or longer-term strategies to really bring them in and catalyze those relationships and get more companies involved?
So I think it's a, if I was to sum it up in a sentiment, it's a more proactive approach to partnership. When Kellie was talking about, you asked her, do you do plans and protocols and exercises and MOUs with cities ahead of time? What her answer was yes, if cities are interested in that. And the reality is, around the world, some cities are interested in that and others don't necessarily get it. And so the more that you can treat responsible private sector as a real, true, full-fledged partner, the better your outcomes are going to be. And it is a fine line because, there in places around the world, corruption, many places around the world, corruption is a real issue. And so politicians are either, wary of being perceived too closely, or unable for rules and regulations to bring the private sector in different ways. And so that certainly is a legitimate issue. But those who involve the private sector early on, we go through a process with cities of helping them put together resilience strategies. And that starts with a very broad scan, and then it gets into more specific kind of exploratory work and crafting initiatives. The cities that involve the private sector well involve the private sector at that broad scan level, and certainly as they're beginning to think about what existing initiatives are. Cities that don't do it well involve the private sector only at the end as a potential resource, a funder, and so on. And the private sector, to everything that Kellie's been saying over this last hour, has so much more to add by way of expertise and technical know-how and facilities and resource. And in fact, just having employees and being members of the community and all of that. So it's trying to understand the full breadth of the opportunity of partnership, doing that proactively, because that will lead to better outcomes.
Yeah, and I think to build on that too, and I'm sure, Michael, you remember this back in when you were at New York, is the relationships that you have. Sometimes while you can have certain protocols in place, picking up the phone with the folks that you have built trust and credibility with are going to be the ones that typically execute really quickly, and that you can make something happen without a formal agreement in place. And that's not to say you shouldn't have these things in place. It's just that the more you can build relationships beforehand and have that cell phone number, and that there's credibility and trust built beforehand, the better. And I can say that over and over again from all of the disasters I've responded to or deployed to.
I just wanted to finish off by asking you both if you think that we're really poised to see a much bigger involvement of businesses and private sector in resilience and disaster preparedness, recovery and response, simply because more disasters are happening in cities, and it's becoming harder and harder to ignore this as something that needs to be tackled. Where do you think we'll be heading with this in the next 5 to 10 years? Michael, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would say that, in every disaster, the private sector is massively and inextricably involved. The question is, are they involved in a joined up way with the government and civil society authorities, or are they involved in a separate way? Because disasters impact all of us. And the private sector, you look around, I'm sitting here in my office in New York, and almost everything I can see is private sector owned and operated. And so, the private sector is for sure going to be involved. The question is, how are they going to be involved? I would say cities have a particularly pragmatic, innovative, can-do way of approaching all of the things that they do. That's why they're so fun and inspirational and refreshing to work with in these times. So to the extent that cities garner more authority, and are able to drive this more, I think that that practical, innovative side will make it so that the private sector is more joined up with the response efforts. To the extent that cities are less empowered and that authority sits somewhere higher, whether it's at the state or the national level, then I think that that will continue to be uneven over the next years, and potentially suboptimal.
Okay, and Kellie, do you see that more companies are going to start taking a proactive approach? Get really stuck in like Airbnb and come up with new ideas and be innovative in this space?
I would say yes. I don't think there's going to be a choice, right? So regardless of if they're preparing to, to be as integrated as we might be, I can't say for sure, but I would say that there's not going to be as things are both natural and man-made, I think it's just going to become pertinent. And I think it obviously behooves everyone to get a little more ahead of it and build these partnerships.
Thank you so much. You've been very generous with your insights, Kellie, about Airbnb's policies in this area. And Michael, so great to have your breadth of experience and insight into so many different cities and how they work. The one thing I'm taking away, I think, at the moment is the real importance of partnerships, and that those cannot be underestimated. And must be nurtured, whether it's within communities, between communities and governments, between private sector and governments, etc. So thank you very much indeed. We've come to time, so we're going to have to finish now. I'd just like to say that we will have a write-up of the webinar on the Zilient.org website in the coming day or two. So everybody who's on the webinar, please do visit Zilient.org, and you can carry on the conversation there. But for now, I'd like to thank our guests very, very much, and also the participants in the webinar. And please do stay in touch and carry on talking with us at Zilient. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye, everybody.